welcome to today's webinar, Reimagining an Optimised Grid with Abundant Storage. I'm James Seymour, CEO of C4Net, and your MC for today. The webinar is designed to spark conversations and thoughts around what does that grid look like, and what are the implications, and what are the opportunities, and the roles of coordination that could be there, and some of the challenges of balancing the needs of various stakeholders that are within there. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands of which we meet today. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respect to elders past and present. We're at the dawn of a new age in the electricity sector, one where we shift from electricity that has to be consumed just after it is generated to one where it can be stored and actually designed for. While we've had hydro for ages, we're now moving to shorter duration storage at all levels through the sector, from generation and large-scale generation and transmission, through all parts of the distribution system, whether it be high voltage, medium voltage, low voltage, and to consumer sites behind the meter and adjacent to the grid through the electrification of transport in our EVs and commercial vehicles. It could be a very rapid rise. And in fact, to date, it already has been. Just looking at California, they already have 13 gigawatt of electricity storage connected to their grid. Importantly, the last 3 gigawatt of that took only 6 months to add. In our NEM here, we see that going from 2024 through to 2026, we're seeing a 7-fold increase in storage being connected to the grid. And that's just to projects that are in tow now. And that'll take us to over 10 gigawatt. AEMO's Integrated System Plan, or the ISP, in its step change scenario of the 2024 edition, calls out that we'll need 37 gigawatt of coordinated storage, around 2/3 of the total storage hoping to be connected. There are many in this sector saying, is that achievable? There's a lot also saying, is it ambitious enough? Can we do more? And with good reason. There's been massive savings identified by groups such as AEMO and the CEC because we can use storage to both smooth out generation and demand and also provide grid resilience services and operational needs. But how to incorporate all this and how to get the best out of it? Well, we need to understand both the communications and network infrastructure that would sit under it, things like how to integrate the opportunities and what sort of coordination might be needed, and how to best balance the needs of the market, of the electricity system, of communities and individuals through that journey. Hopefully, today's webinar will shed some insights on that. And we're really, really delighted to have 4 experts in the field join us. These experts are leading efforts to design the roadmaps and publish them, the stated goals of where we're moving to. Identifying the industry policy and consumer needs that are there, setting the goals and the plans, and also doing research underneath to help us try and reimagine that future and then try to put some sense to what might be an optimised pathway there. Which is a great segue into our first speaker. Professor Pierluigi Mancarella is the Chair Professor of Electrical Power Systems at the University of Melbourne, and he's been leading some work on the development of novel techno-economic approaches to assessing the use and integration of storage. Pierluigi, thank you so much for joining us today. Over to you.
Thank you so much, James. It's a great pleasure to be here. So let me try to share my screen. Okay. Great. So thanks for the opportunity to present. So what I'm going to show is a little bit of the work actually we're doing as a part of the project with C4Net, the enhanced system plan with specific application to Victoria. But then, of course, there will be also some more general thinking. In general, we're having like lots of very exciting. We are somehow facing an epochal transition. Yeah? When you look at the shift towards renewables, and of course, as part of the shift, also the need for energy storage to be able to firm up renewable. Now, besides that, there is what we have defined, can be defined as a Copernican revolution for the grid, that doesn't look only at the types of resources that you have in the grid, particularly renewables and storage as opposed to conventional generators, but also the fact that now consumers and consumer energy resources start playing a fundamental role, especially because of electrification of heating and transport, besides the cost of rooftop PV and distributed batteries becoming lower and lower. So because of this, in fact, we see that in the scenarios that we somehow believe are quite realistic for Australia, there will be very important role played by these distributed energy resources at the consumer premises in particular. As I said, rooftop PV, but also coordinated storage in different forms. Now, in general, if you look at this from a little bit more academic perspective, when you look at a grid with increasing penetration of renewables like we're seeing here in the NEM, how much of what kind of storage do we need? So we look at this kind of picture, this is like a summary of many hundreds of studies that were reviewed in this paper some time ago. Effectively, if you look at different types of studies looking at increasing penetration of renewables in different jurisdictions around the world, particularly Europe, US, and Germany, you will see that with increasing penetration levels, effectively the amount of storage you will need in terms of power capacity, so the gigawatts, grows somehow linearly, and the amount of energy that you need to grow somehow superlinearly. So effectively, with more and more renewables in the grid, we need to store increasing more energy compared to capacity. Also, the types of storage then that we need is also changes with time. Effectively, we start talking about, for example, longer duration batteries and longer duration storage with time. What is also very important is that if you look at all these kind of studies, the type of generation actually also matters. In particular, the more rooftop PV we have in the grid, the more storage, in particular distributed storage, you will need in the grid to balance properly from a operational perspective, also from an optimal investment perspective, the entire system. And this is in fact what somehow we also see in the NEM, because if you look at the amount of dispatchable generation that we see, somehow you see that the amount of coordinated CR storage that we see in IEMO's forecast is greater and greater, and somehow this increasing is also with both the expected penetration of rooftop PV, but also with the more and more distributed resources that become available at cheaper price, including as part of electrification of heating and transport. Now, what can we say in a system and during the transition in terms of what kind of grid we're going to see moving from a traditional fossil fuel-based grid with basically no renewables and storage to one dominated by renewables and storage? So I took a very interesting work done by some colleagues at MIT. And if you take like a very simple case, it's a kind of idealized grid, but just not to try to understand the first principles. So there is a demand of 100 gigawatts, certain value of lost load, 85% of round-trip efficiency for energy storage. And then you imagine that this grid will be composed of peakers and base load. You can imagine gas turbines as peakers, base load generators like coal generators, then variable renewable energy, for example, a mix of wind and solar, and then energy storage. And then you have a certain capital cost, certain variable cost attached to that. Now imagine that you have different scenarios, effectively modeling somehow the transition that we're seeing. And then you start saying that, for example, if you have a scenario with only the conventional generators, so peakers and base load, then you depend, of course, no, this is just this is the case study, right? Depends on the specific numbers will depend on specific inputs, the type of loads that you have and so on. But the first principles still apply. So in a system with only base load generation and peakers, eventually you will have like a mix of the two. Then you start introducing renewables in the grid that you see here in gray, and these renewables start displacing primarily the base load generators. This is effectively what we see with coal in the And then say, well, now I start adding more and more storage, while eventually I also increase penetration level of renewables. Now, what happens is that you displace a little bit more of base load generators, so more coal somehow is displaced, and a little bit of peaking generation, the gas turbines are also displaced, because now storage can actually also play the kind of the peaking role, besides providing overall flexibility to the system. And then you keep going, and eventually in a grid that is dominated by renewables and storage, you have an optimal balance of both, but of course with very much larger capacity for both to be able to supply the grid. What does it mean in terms of, for example, the net load and the prices that we see? Well, when you have a mix of fossil fuel, conventional generators, renewables, and storage, somehow we have a situation like we see in the grid, where the peakers make contribute to determine the prices to recover the investment, and then somehow there is a balance between what happens with base load and energy curtailment. What happens, however, in a grid that was only based on renewables and storage, where effectively the situation is pretty different, and there are two main very important findings that for me are very relevant to the transition we see. The first one is that the actual marginal cost that we see in the market, so the prices actually we see in the market, can no longer reflect just the marginal cost, because these generators effectively are now zero marginal cost for renewables, and for storage you cannot even define. It's really about opportunity cost. So the prices we see are actually a function of investment cost. So this somehow raises the question as to whether a market like an energy-only market is at all suitable to actually to operate in a grid like this. The other important thing is actually that the amount of load that you would shed, ideally in an optimized grid with lots of renewables and storage, where this optimal amount of load you curtail is actually much greater than other grid. And they say, well, then what does it mean? That effectively we need to give up lots of consumption, disconnect consumers, and so on? Well, not really, because what is the kind of load that eventually we will need to shed? Where this depends a lot on the kind of demand that you will see. And the very nice thing is that much of the demand that you will see will come from electrification. What I'm highlighting here effectively would be largely based on electric vehicles, hot water storage, thermal loads, and so on. So all this demand flexibility is can be huge. In fact, we're talking about some form of storage that will be associated with the grid, that, however, is not necessarily modeled as such or considered as such. So when you look then at the kind of work that we're doing in SIFONET, effectively we try to understand, when you look at electrification of Victoria and all this demand side flexibility and storage associated with that, what can we say for the overall grid developments? In particular, if you can use lots of flexibility from hot water, for example, from thermal storage in buildings, for example, and you have huge potential for demand response, what does it mean for an optimized grid? If you can shift hot water demand, for example, to make it coincide when there is like lots of distributed solar energy, what can you say about that? When you have huge amount of storage in cars, and in fact you can provide a huge amount of upward flexibility, so charging storage and downward flexibility, discharging storage at the consumer levels because of the cars. How much storage then will we need, for example, at transmission level once you have so much distributed storage? So effectively, the grid somehow becomes an active resource that can optimally interface with the transmission grid. And with this concept that we now, I think many of us are familiar with, dynamic operating envelopes, we can guarantee also that network constraints are not breached at any time. So you can start orchestrating or coordinating all these distributed resources and playing somehow an optimal role together with the transmission grid, at both operational level and investment level. In particular, when you look at investment, and now we're doing this work, effectively saying, what happens if you start putting all this flexibility into the integrated system plan. So we see that systematically you can start shifting investments in generation, transmission, and storage from generation, network, and storage from transmission to distribution. And on top of that, we start seeing that there are huge benefits in terms of complementarity between the investments, because the more distributed energy resources we have in the grid, actually, the more we can deal with the huge investment uncertainty that we're seeing at the transmission level. So in fact, DR and CR become start having a huge risk hedge value for the whole system, and this is somehow not captured at all in any study. So we're keeping doing the modeling. So stay tuned for what comes next. Just to give a little bit of an overview of the main thoughts we have so far. Thank you.
Excellent, Pierluigi. Thank you so much. You're going to have you've got all our minds open now and activated, ready to ask questions and everything. So I do encourage you to please post questions. Pierluigi's given it quite a framework there that he's working through. I'd now like to introduce Dominic Vandenberg. Dom is the CEO of the Energy Networks Association, or ENA. Dom, stage is yours.
Thanks very much, James, and thanks, Gordon, for such a smooth transition with the slides. Hello to everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today. I thought it would be good for me to take you through a bit of research that we did actually 9 months ago, but we continue to talk about it because it does seem to have got traction. And let me just give you a bit of background to that. So yeah, thank you. First slide there. The exam question was, alongside large-scale generation and transmission, is there more we can do in the distribution grid that can be unlocked and enabled now? And so the idea of this is that, can we use what we have better? And if we see the grid as more than poles and wires, what might that look like? Importantly here, we laid over practicable actions based on what our members are saying, so particularly the DNSPs, practicable actions that can be taken out and actually have an impact by 2030. So if we flick to the next slide, I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk through the modeling approach. So we took a comprehensive whole of system modeling approach. Sometimes we ban that word around, but actually I think that's why we've got traction on this report, because it genuinely is the whole of system energy cost and the whole of wallet for the customer, right? So when we talk about energy cost for the customer, especially with the rise of EVs, we've got to be talking about the cost versus electricity versus like diesel and petrol, right? And so we looked at that full cost rather than saying just electricity only, because of course electricity is going to increase if you are offsetting diesel and petrol through EVs. We then tested which actions would be value accretive all the way out to 2050, but we took a slice there by 2030 to show what the near-term impacts would be. Again, because we wanted this to be a practicable set of actions that we could really get after, and not something that might happen in 15, 20 years' time, but like here and now. So the starting point was the ISP step change 2024. And we're saying, keep your foot down on large-scale renewables and transmission, but what if it's prolonged by a few years? And so unsurprisingly, this creates an emissions gap, and it also creates a cost gap, right? But it also, it means then that like you have to look at other opportunities to kind of fill that. So we layered on this series of what ifs. And if I can quickly kind of run through, we said, add more rooftop solar, do it behind the meter or in front of the meter with storage. Add more community generation, and that is really connecting renewables straight into the distribution grid. Go faster on home business electrification, that's the conversion of gas. Add more EVs to the system. So I think the ISP calls for 3 million, add another 1 million. What would that look like? And then the final one was on CER coordination, which we just heard in the last presentation. We wanted to test how valuable this actually was. And so we all know there are some very bold assumptions, as we've just seen in the ISP step change. We wanted to back that out and say, what is the value of this and how important is it that we really get after it? We then ranked these and we optimized, the kind of combination of them. So if we flick to the next page, the kind of headline on this one is that we're saying by 2030, if we look at this through the lens of the customer, all customers, even the customer that doesn't take action, so the customer that doesn't buy an EV, the customer that doesn't get solar on their roof, that customer would save $160 versus not taking this action. We know that there's a lot of hype out there about how you can bring customer bills down from today. What we're saying is versus not taking these actions, you'd bring down costs by $160. If you have the time and the inclination, the report's on our website, and we take you through each customer archetype. The customer that has no EVs, no EV, no solar, no battery, all the way through to the customer that does, and every customer would save because the grid is doing more for all customers. What that means is that as a cost to the overall system, it reduces that by $7 billion a year. And in this case, we're saying it actually helps secure the 82% renewable. So you remember when I took you through those scenarios, we said, what if we go at a pace on the large scale generation and transmission that is the best we've done so far? And if we go at that pace, where do we get to? And that takes us to 74%. This then gets us right back up to 82%. There is a whole piece behind the analysis, but I thought in 10 minutes I'm not going to be able to get through. So then the question is, to the next slide, what are the actual actions that we're calling for in this report? And we've kind of laid out 5 here. The first is linking local energy hubs. We're seeing this already in Queensland and the start of it in New South Wales. And what we're saying is that if you're going to connect renewables straight into the distribution network, we've got to be able to remove that first mover disadvantage. So the first mover of that is really paying a higher connection cost. Remove that and have more of that hub type of mentality, and look at the regulatory framework to work out how best to innovate in this space. The second one was to amplify untapped solar, and this is particularly on C&I buildings, and I know Matt's coming up next. We'll likely talk about that too as one of the CCA findings. But when you're flying into Melbourne and Sydney and you're looking out the window, you're seeing a lot of commercial roof space there. Issue with commercial roof space is that often the users are not the owners of those commercial buildings, and being able to really use those buildings because it's generally close to a high level of load would be a smart thing to do. The third area here was to say, okay, more solar, as we know, needs to be complemented with storage, which is the point of today's discussion, I think. And we said there's a missing middle here where we can use existing substations and you can put 5 megawatt, 10 megawatt hours batteries into those substations. The benefit of this is that it uses brownfield sites, so there's less of a social license concern. But it also means that there is a scale efficiency here with networks being able to put this in. Importantly, and I'll come to this in a little bit more detail, we're saying that it needs to be a partnership between retailers and networks to access as much of the network value as possible. And I'll talk about that in a slide in a bit more. The fourth one was on plug in more EV chargers. And what we're saying here is that research has found one of the largest barriers to getting more EVs on the road is a lack of charging infrastructure and range anxiety. And so there's an opportunity to put pole top chargers on existing power poles and reduce that range anxiety. And so, the global average is you've got, I think, you've got 11 EVs per charger. Australia's got 68. So we're kind of in that leaderboard where we really don't want to be. And the opportunity to get more charges in is absolutely crucial if we're going to see those EVs take off. And then the final one, which again links to the previous presentation, is what is the opportunity to sync with the grid and customer energy resources? And we put a number on that to say there's $37 billion in avoided network costs if we get this right. And so it's absolutely paramount that we really do get our skates on how best to sync consumer energy resources and soak up that additional renewables at the right time. If I can just double click last slide then on the storage element of this. So you saw in the model earlier, we said we did model behind the meter and front of the meter storage. We found through this modeling that there's a 20% benefit in putting that directly into the distribution on the substations. I want to just reinforce, we absolutely believe you need storage everywhere. The ISP already assumes quite a fair bit of storage in behind the meter, saying if there's an opportunity to go further, and we're talking like 5 gigawatts by 2030, putting that front of the meter according to our model, was a smart thing to do. And the opportunity here is that by using that existing brownfield space, but also it means that those customers that can't afford a battery in their own home would get the benefit of that battery. So you really are starting to share the benefits of localized generation and storage. But the key here is a partnership with third parties to enable this value stack. And so when we talk about the value stack of a battery, obviously, as you know, there's a technical group on the call. You can get the wholesale value, FCAS value, which retailers need to be able to access. But we could flange that up more with network value, avoided cost of building out that network, and share all of that value back with customers. We're saying on this, there's two actions that need to be happen, and it's we are starting to see progress in the right direction here. The first is kind of, at the minute, regulation prohibits networks from owning batteries if they're participating in the wholesale market. And again, we say we don't want to participate in the wholesale market. That should be retailers. But there is an opportunity to get a waiver, so there's not battery by battery, to make sure that this is possible. And so it's a class waiver. And then the second is to really look at the value of these batteries and make sure that we are properly accommodating all values and properly assessing the value of those, not just the value of shifting solar to later. So the value of solar in the middle of the day, which we know is increasingly less and less, it's the value of what it is like later in the day. And so there's a complicated formula that sits behind it. But we're saying don't miss an opportunity to accurately recognize that customer value. I'm going to leave it there and looking forward to any further questions you might have later on.
Excellent, Dom. Thank you so much. I love it how you brought it down to the actionable bits as well, and really with that Time Is Now report, really thought about the practical implementation. It's one that a lot of those align with what we're seeing with the ESP. It's logical consequences, if you like, of some of the ESP work that we're doing. I'd now like to introduce Matt Searson. Matt's got an amazing job as Acting General Manager of Analysis at the Climate Change Authority, or CCA. Matt, over to you.
All right. Thank you, James. Very happy to be here, and hello, everyone. So just a quick intro on the Climate Change Authority. There's a number of organisations with a similar name, so I just want to let you know that the Climate Change Authority is an independent authority within the Commonwealth Government's climate change portfolio. The Climate Change Authority's role is to provide independent advice to government on all matters to do with climate change. So it's a very wide scope of work, but as decarbonisation of the electricity grid is one critical matter in reducing Australia's emissions, the authority does spend a fair bit of time thinking about the electricity sector. And you may have seen the authority in the news this week with its release of its analysis of a nuclear proposal. Okay, next slide, please. So each year the authority releases its annual progress report. So the annual progress report provides advice to the Climate Change Minister on progress with all matters to do with climate change. But as I say, the authority does focus in on the electricity sector. And in its 2024 annual progress report, the authority made 4 recommendations regarding the electricity sector, and you can see those on the screen now, numbered 1 through 4. And at the bottom of those big squares, you can see it says noted, agreed, or agreed in principle. Those were the government's responses to those 4 recommendations from the authority. So I'll just briefly go through those. So the first was to strengthen, broaden, lengthen, and embed the capacity investment scheme. So the authority is very focused on the ability of Australia to achieve the minus 43% by 2030 target, and decarbonisation of the electricity grid will be critical there, and a policy mechanism to continue to drive renewables will be needed to achieve that goal. It's the authority's view. And some of you may know the authority is currently preparing its advice to government on Australia's 2035 target, and the authority at least said last year that that advice would be in the range of 65 to 75% below 2005 levels by 2035. So an ambitious target, and it will be necessary to have a policy mechanism that keeps driving renewables beyond 2030. Recommendation 2, it goes with recommendation 1. It's answering the question of how do we maintain system security when we're transitioning the grid to renewables at such a rapid pace. And this recommendation was that AEMO be given a role and a power to procure and to plan and deploy synchronous condensers across the national electricity market and in the West to ensure the stability of the grid. Recommendation 3 was to speed up connection times. And the recommendation I want to dwell on with you today is recommendation 4, and this recommendation the authority was very interested in with the ideas that the ENA put out in their Time Is Now report that Dom has just spoken to. And so this recommendation picks up on a number of elements covered in that report, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that now. So let's see if that's on the next slide. The authority is currently providing further advice to government on those 4 recommendations, and we'll advance through our expert consultation process, and we're currently working on a report that will be delivered to government by the end of April. Next slide, please. Okay, so here are the elements of that recommendation 4, that is to make full use of the potential contributions of the electricity distribution networks, and as well, and within that, commercial and industrial customers' premises to host renewable electricity generation and storage. So there's a few elements to this, elements A through E. So the first is to develop and implement a scheme to incentivise the deployment of solar and storage on commercial and industrial premises. Now, what we've noted is that there's a large potential, as Dom mentioned, for this. There's large roof space. And so what we've been doing, the authority's been doing, is consulting with experts on their views about this and why this is. And so there's a range of views. So, you know, one of them primarily is, well, a lot of these roofs aren't strong enough to host a large number of panels on their roofs. So obviously that knocks out some buildings. And it was suggested to the authority that the older buildings may not have the structural integrity to support solar on their roofs. So then on to recommendation B, require distribution network service providers to deliver timely connections. So this is something we also heard, that we heard feedback that yes, there's lots of ambition and enthusiasm for connecting solar and storage in these locations. However, there have been some experiences where commercial building owners had advice that that connection wasn't possible, or the distribution network was too crowded in that location. And just briefly, I might just jump back to the first recommendation. So the incentives for commercial and industrial customers to take up solar. So we also heard that the small-scale renewable energy target could be a factor. The 100 kilowatt threshold could be shaping decisions that are made by commercial and industrial customers in how they design their PV system. So that it's limited to well under the 100 kilowatt threshold. The other thing we've heard is that they've heard about the split incentive for landlords versus owners of these buildings, and that landlords versus tenants of these buildings, and that tenants tend to size PV systems appropriate to their demand and their use for electricity, rather than maximising the deployment of PV on those roofs to benefit the distribution grid more broadly. Now I'll just jump to C. So this is empower DNSPs to plan and install batteries in their networks. And so this picks up on the recommendation from ENA that Dom just spoke to. So yes, there's been some experience with a community batteries program and a waiver being applied for DNSPs to install more batteries. The authority is of the view that more of this would be a good idea, and because they will create the space for more commercial industrial solar deployment. And then D and E, establish a framework for a coordination between DNSPs and TNSPs to make sure there's efficient use of the existing network, and also for the EV charging on street side EV charging deployed by DNSPs is also a recommendation of the authority. And E, accelerate the mandatory regulated deployment of smart meters as well. Okay, next slide, please. So in terms of what we've heard about recommendation 4, so we've consulted across the board, including with ENA, Pierre Luigi as well, C4Net, with DQ, but a whole range of organisations through our consultation. And across those 4 recommendations that I spoke about at the start of the session, and there is so much enthusiasm and so much optimism about recommendation 4, getting more out of the distribution system. So there's a lot of support for this. We've heard some feedback. There's some limitations. There's some patchy availability of space within the distribution network. It'd be good to have more transparency about where that patchiness is and where the biggest opportunities are. I've mentioned the feedback about CNI rooftop and also the split incentive issues. So I think I might wrap up my presentation there. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. And it was compelling how strong the storage mechanism was in that report and brought out as one of those key areas. So hopefully we'll have some further questions on that.
Yeah.
Now, our next speaker, we have just had a couple of technical challenges here with James White. So we're just going to see, we're not quite sure whether we're going to get his presentation up. We'll certainly make it available. But James, there we go. Our tech team have done a great job here. James, can we just check that we can hear you?
Okay, can you hear me through my phone?
Amazing, we can. Great effort. Thank you for your persistence, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So I'm James White, I'm branch head for Consumer Energy Resources in the Federal DQ, and also sort of chair of the CER working group and task force. Apologies, due to the technical issues, I have no idea what any of the speakers before me said. So if there's any repetition, I'm sorry about that. If we just jump on to the next slide, thank you. I think everyone's probably familiar with this graph. It's just a scenario, not a projection, but this is AEMO's view of the sort of least cost development pathway to get through to 82% renewables by 2030 and net zero by 2050. And if you can see the graph, you can see obviously the numbers on the left-hand side of the column, but there's a very large amount of passive CER storage and an extraordinarily large amount of coordinated CER storage that's required, particularly from 2030, to help achieve that least cost outcome. And from where we are at the moment, a lot of the CER storage and consumer energy resources generally are not very visible. And over time, they're probably going to generate between 15 and 30% of the electricity supply in the eastern states, probably similar in WA. And the fact that they're not very visible and not controllable means that people's private capital investment into these resources can lead to system outcomes that can go well, or they can go very, very badly. So if we just jump to the next slide. Okay. And this slide is one that my team's put together. They've just taken the actuals from Sunwood's estimate of actual small-scale battery storage deployment and added on what the, I guess, scenario projections are for the integrated system plan and the West Australian ESO. You can see there's a discontinuity there at 2023. So if Sunwood is correct, then maybe the dashed line will be higher. But there's clearly a very large number of gigawatt hours of battery storage potentially coming. And this really underscores the need to get policy settings right for small-scale behind-the-meter storage. So if we go to the next slide, the ministers from all states and territories on the Energy and Climate Change Ministerial Council last year in July agreed to a National Consumer Energy Resources Roadmap. Now, I appreciate for a lot of people, firstly, you probably don't know that there is a Consumer Energy Resources Roadmap. And if you're looking at this slide, it may be very, very difficult to see the text on it, particularly on the roadmap vision, outcomes and principles. But what it's saying there is that there are 4 work streams around consumers, technology, markets and power system operations. And within those, there are 14 national reform priorities. And these relate to all kinds of consumer energy resources. So not just storage, but also flexible demand devices and rooftop PV. And because we're looking at storage in the world of both behind the meter fixed storage, like a household battery, but also the potential for EV-based storage through vehicle to home or vehicle to grid. Storage looms very, very large in terms of this work stream. So those four work streams, the reason they've been identified is because essentially the power system is currently configured in terms of markets, technology, and consumer protections to facilitate one-way transfer of power from large-scale power stations through a transmission network, distribution network, and then through a meter into a consumer's house. And they don't generate any power of their own, they don't store any power of their own, and they don't send it back anywhere in that world, like through a VPP. So 15 years ago, that was pretty much the world we were in. But now we're in a world where actually there's a lot of generation at consumer level, there's an increasing amount of storage at consumer level, and there's a potential for a very large amount of flexible demand coming through at consumer level. And so our roadmap work is designed to basically maximise the benefits of having these CER devices in a behind-the-meter context and looking at the scale of electricity supply that I just mentioned, which could be like 15 to 30%, and making sure that there's a set of measures in place that enable us to optimise that in a way that minimises network costs, minimises wholesale electricity costs, and maximises the benefits to consumers, including the ones who don't have consumer energy resources, because under current configuration, there can be a lot of cross-subsidy occurring from the people who don't have CER to the people who can put CER on. We jump to the next slide. Okay, this is just to give an illustration of what's in the roadmap. I won't dwell on this one, just to say, if you look at the roadmap, this graph shows the snake diagram of work from last year through to 2030, colour-coded by work stream, and captures the key milestones. So I won't stay on this in terms of the presentation, but if you want to see what the forward work plan is, This is described in a fair amount of detail in the roadmap. If we jump to the next slide. So this slide's titled How the CER Roadmap Supports Storage. It's probably more accurate to say this is how the roadmap engages with storage. So there's a set of interoperability standards, so basically communication standards that we've had the ANU work on for us in the CER task force over the last year, and we're preparing those for public consultation in the next quarter of this year. And it will include standards for vehicle to grid. We're also looking at a national technical regulatory framework because we've based the roadmap off a huge amount of work that's been done by a lot of people over a long time, and particularly some very good work by the former Energy Security Board and the Eastern States market bodies, but also some very sort of Australia-leading work by the Western Australian Government Energy Policy WA and their own DER roadmap over there. So one of the things that has been asked for by everyone out of that is a regulatory framework and a national CER technical regulator. So we're also looking at public consultation on that. Things that are not on this slide, but I think I should mention, yes, there's streamlining network connections and flexible export limits there, but the roadmap also has a lot of measures in it to progress projects on network visibility at distribution level, and also for the market operator to be able to better understand what's happening at distribution level. Data sharing, there needs to be a lot more data sharing in a high CER world. And related to that, we've got a project going on that the AEMC is leading for us as part of the task force to identify the distribution system and market roles and responsibilities. And so all of these things are designed to create better visibility of CER, help people better understand what the opportunities are, and hopefully create the consumer benefits that I mentioned and avoid costs that can be incurred through planners not being able to know how much CER is out there and how it might respond. I do have one more slide, but I think I might stop there and hand back to you, James. Thank you.
Thank you, James, and my apologies for not introducing you properly at the start there, just as I tried to work through the technical challenges there. James, that was really appreciated. Incredible workload that's out there. And one thing about the roadmap for me is it takes a very complex forward path of what is needed to do and breaks it down into some quite chunky deliverables. None of them simple, big workloads on each of those. James, I'm hoping that you can join us for the questions. I'll ask Matt, Dominic, and Pierluigi to please join us now and turn your cameras on so that we can come together as a panel to address some of the questions. And certainly, James, hope you can as well there. One of the things that we've spoken through today has been different types of storage, and there's been a question in the chat around whether this is just battery storage or are we talking others. So I think we recognise that there are a couple of the presentations. For example, the CER roadmap is focused particularly on CER, the consumer devices that are there. Others we're looking at, but different forms of storage within there. And certainly from both the ESP point of view, and I think I certainly heard elements of other speakers really covering all storage, both in terms of where within the grid and what form of storage is there. Which sort of leads us to a question then. Are all forms of storage good? Are there ones that are particular priorities? Are the ones that we need to address first? Or is it still to be determined? Pierluigi, any thoughts there? And I'll then just bring the other speakers in.
Thanks, James. Yes, storage is good, of course, and the more renewals we have, the more storage we will need, especially for to store more energy. In terms of what storage, where storage they can be very, very cheap, and eventually, let us not forget, it's about decarbonizing the whole energy system. So I can think of hot water. So that is no brainer. We just do anything we could to electrify hot water, and then we use your storage. Very good also paid to rooftop PV. And then we need to understand the moment that we have more and more electric vehicles in the grid, a little bit in an anticipative way, how much storage we'll be able to have at the consumer's premises, depending on the charging profiles and so on. Otherwise, probably going to look into some form of community batteries, for example, substation level batteries. They may be more cost efficient than, for example, distributed batteries. So these are the kind of priorities I would say to consider more seriously.
Yeah, thank you, Dom. From a network perspective, so you just heard Pierluigi mention, various forms in there. Do you look at it from all perspectives? Is there one area that's better than the other? Are they complementary?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly from a battery storage perspective, the ones right through from the kind of 5 megawatt in the home all the way through to, I was talking about 5 megawatt, 10 megawatt hour. So another question further down there, try to answer in real time, but it's the wrong button. All the way through to the 300 megawatt kind of on the transmission scale. All of it is good. It serves a purpose, and there's different kind of use cases depending on where it is. So I think we're seeing that storage is going to answer that. And I think Pierluigi also said the more as technology starts to bring the cost curve down, of course, then considering different forms, and especially as that gets longer duration, that might well be the sweet spot. The 4 hour, 8 hour is where I think everyone would love the system to get to if it's that kind of that kind of longer term storage.
And behind that, you mean particularly for the peak management, the daily sort of cycle peak management.
Yeah.
Okay. Matt, from a climate perspective, are there different forms that really help couple with renewables, or is it again that they're all reasonably useful?
It's all levers pulled from the Climate Change Authority's perspective. Large scale pumped hydro, fantastic. Snow 2.0 is going to be a massively positive asset for the grid and for Australia. Large scale storage on transmission, let's get more of it. And then, as I focused on in my presentation, storage within the distribution network. We've got so much rooftop solar, and a lot of it just going to waste, and that's just the tragedy. We need to be efficient and make use of all that energy that's being captured and get that stored, whether that's behind the meter or in front of the meter. All levers pulled. We need all those things to happen.
And then, James, a lot of what Matt just said seems to be reflected in the CER roadmap, but are there then are any of those particular more challenging or more pressing for you?
So I'm focused on the CER side of it rather than large scale. To go back to your kind of original question, is all storage equal, or is some storage more equal than others? I think I'm thinking with Matt and Dom on this one, that pull every lever. In terms of what we're doing under the roadmap, we've got a number of projects, and one of those is looking at the tariff structures as well. Within the distribution networks, we've got huge amounts of solar, as Matt was just saying, and overall we've got kind of excess solar during the day a lot of the time. So where it's cost effective to have storage, we should make use of that resource. And as Pierluigi said, hot water is one of those things. So if we had a tariff structure that actually supported daytime hot water charging for the electric systems, hot water heating, that would probably be a very simple sort of, well, relatively simple, nothing simple in space, but relatively simple first step to applying a different kind of energy storage to that excess. And so, but then you have to look at, well, a lot of people on off-peak rates that say electricity's super cheap at night. and are on a flat tariff during the day, it actually makes it more expensive to do the daytime charging. So there's daytime heating. So there's a lot of stuff to do there, but I think overall, definitely more storage is probably better. And I agree with Dom, they've all got their use cases.
Yeah, that alignment of incentives all the way through the electricity system, so that when you see a demand or a change in behaviour that you want, so that it flows through to the very people who can actually action that, seems to be a perennial challenge that is in there. Pierluigi, can you elaborate on the coordination of storage at the distribution level, CER and DER, and how it affects the investment at the distribution and transmission levels, including the large-scale generation and storage?
Yeah, so effectively, there are two fundamental benefits opportunities that are emerging. One is that by an intelligent, let's say, orchestration, it can be achieved in different ways, including in some cases in an automatic way. You can certainly reduce the need for investment infrastructure at the distribution level. So effectively, the so-called non-network solutions can be represented by different forms of storage, including CR. So when we talk about flexible demand and consumer energy resources, somehow, these are all forms of storage. If we think of storage maybe just as batteries, but electric vehicles, hot water storage, and so on. This is really like storage. And you can call it storage or flexible demand. That doesn't really matter. Eventually, it's just flexibility you can embed in there. So once you can do that, you can displace distribution network infrastructure, and this is something that is being considered quite seriously by many DSPs. But then on top of that, the moment you start integrating the potential of distributed energy resources to interact better with the transmission grid, then certainly all our work shows that there are huge benefits in shifting some of the investments from transmission to distribution, and overall providing very significant savings for the system. So it is not just a shift of a value; is actually a decrease overall the cost for the whole system, which again makes sense, particularly in a system like Australia, where there is so much rooftop PV, there's already generating in the market negative prices. So how can we deal really, in a kind of bottom-up way with those negative prices, where try to balance effectively the rooftop PV injection to a grid where it happens. In other jurisdictions, it may be completely different, but certainly makes lots of sense in Australia.
Okay. Dominique, we've had a couple of questions in there around sort of what sort of regulations need to change to allow a smooth pathway for energy hubs and opportunities. We've also had comments, questions around the use of dynamic tariffs and network support contracts, etc., and using the markets a bit more. To what extent, within the current regulatory settings, can we simply leave it to markets in order to get sufficient storage within the distribution networks, or if not, what needs to change?
Yeah, so there's a lot in those questions, and we did pull out in our report kind of some of the key actions. Some of them are regulatory, some of them are policy. Some of them is just a function, I think, of the cost curve coming down. So batteries is a really good example of that, where we are starting to see the cost of batteries coming down. And take the substation battery, what I spoke to, and the 5 megawatt, 10 megawatt hour. So there is the opportunity for the market. Someone asked a question then on explain more the value pools. The opportunity for the market, and by that I mean the retailer, to pretty much lease from networks that battery capacity, right? To lease from networks that battery capacity, put it into the market to take advantage of those negative prices, take advantage of FCAS opportunities when it comes to that being available. And if you flange that alongside where Pierluigi was speaking to, a value pool that says, well, we can avoid network build-outs because we can use this battery in a way that allows us not to build more. There's a value there of network batteries. those together would then bring, again to Pierluigi's point, the whole system costs down, and that gets shared back with customers. And so the regulatory side of that is saying, okay, but we need the kind of clear lines of what is or is not in the regulatory space, what is in the competitive or the non-competitive space. And actually we're saying here's an opportunity where there are different value pools for the different proponents. You can combine those together, and you can do that through a kind of waiver, and then you can share those values back with customers. So it's a bit of an interesting one, though, because you need the market to be able to say, yeah, we are there now for the wholesale value, that negative pricing of charge and discharge. We're there on FCAS. And so the value ascribed to the network obviously can't be enormous. It needs to be like, right sized. And when you put all that together, you're getting the market coming through and saying we're ready to go on this. And that's almost like that final bit is then flanged up. So I think there's a kind of conflation of many factors starting to come together, and we are at the right side of seeing that we definitely need battery prices to keep going in the direction that they're going.
I'll move to the next question, but Mike, if we get time, I'd love to come back, and it's for all panelists here, in relation to just, we talk about the availability of storage and control, but it then, I often hear, both reluctance to think of passing control to others, but also then the amount, the actual quantum that we're talking that needs to be controlled or actively managed is often very, very small. So I'd be interested to hear if we can shed any light on that. But Matt, I might come to you with a question. Of course, this is all, and we touched on it a couple of times. This is all happening as in the storage coming in at the same time that energy demand is growing so much, and both at a power and a energy level that this Pierluigi mentioned. Especially from we hear of the data centers and the AI type impact coming in. If storage isn't available in the levels required in the distribution networks, what are the alternatives? Are they viable, desirable, or and can we still meet our zero targets, or how crucial is storage in there?
Storage is essential because we're moving to a renewables-based grid, 82% by 2030, and as published by the authority in its sector pathways review that I hope a lot of you saw last year, much more than 82% by 2050. And so that will only be enabled by there being adequate storage to support the operation of such a grid at the large scale and the small scale. And the authority's made other recommendations as well about, as I mentioned, the deployment of and rapid deployment of synchronous condensers on the grid as well to ensure the security of the grid's operation. But no, in the authority's view of the electricity sector, more wide-scale deployment of storage is critical, and the next 5 years will be a critical component of that. The authority it has in mind the challenges that exist on the transmission system, and we've seen that and heard about that, gaining social license for transmission projects themselves and also large-scale projects out on transmission networks. And so that's part of the reason why the authority is focused in on the opportunities in the distribution network, because it may be the case that there's less resistance to the deployment of storage on the distribution network at various locations where it may not be obvious to anyone in the community that there's anything different going on at that place. There's just a big building there, big nondescript building, but now it just happens to have a battery out the back or stored inside it. So that's the reason why the authority is focusing on the opportunities on the distribution network, because That's of the view, and what we've heard is there's opportunities for quick gains there, and that's what we need. We need to move quickly on this to reduce emissions and meet Australia's emission reduction targets.
It's interesting when you said, yeah, what you're solving for, and when you're very much on that adoption for the there's so many. One of the things that is great about storage is that it can address a number of issues. And Dom pulled up the value stack before, and that's just around the real time thing rather than the overall strategies as well. So whether it be lowering infrastructure costs, whether it be incorporation into renewables, etc. So yeah, really. Really interesting. James, hoping you're able to join us here. Just one here around what's the missing engagement process or missing from the engagement process, needed to realise more, control or use or that consumer interaction?
That's a really good question. We actually have a project on that. But probably the thing that's absolutely needed by consumers to get greater orchestration through control of devices, as opposed to greater orchestration through the right sort of tariff incentives and so forth. The thing that would be needed there is trust, and trust requires understanding. And Matt also commented on social license. Like there's, some social license challenges on the large scale utilities and transmission side. And there seems to be less of an issue in the distribution side. But that's only true if the distribution related costs don't go up through the roof. So social license tends to turn up in a slightly different way in the distribution networks. So one of the things that we want to avoid is some of the changes in distribution level costs that occurred in the late 2000s and early 2010s. And that's why a lot of this need for network visibility and to some degree orchestration through control and, solar backstops and things, why it's actually so important to make sure that we've got a system where networks can plan for the CER and know where it is, and the system can be operated with a view of what's happening. But we also need to make sure that we've got a whole bunch of consumer protections in place that make sure consumers can be confident in what services they're going to get from anyone who they do hand their control over to. So we do have a project on that in the roadmap C3. But I think that's a very important element, and learning or observing by other people doing will be very important as well, as it would not take very long if in the sort of hypothetical vehicle to grid scenario for stories to get round of, oh yeah, the aggregator drained my battery and I couldn't get to the school the next morning kind of thing. That sort of stuff will kill off trust and the required social license very, very quickly. So there do need to be very, very good operations carried out, and there do need to be a pretty thorough set of consumer protections behind it. And then consumers have to understand and be brought along on that journey to make sure that they are comfortable that those things are in place.
Yeah, and I think that's one of those really tough challenges, really trying to envisage that future as well, because while us in the energy sector may think about much of this, of course, many consumers and users don't. James, just while we've got you, there has been a question in relation to how can industry take part in the standards work being done under the CER roadmap. How to quickly tell them how they can best be in touch?
Well, they can get in touch with me. But we have a CER task force reference group as well, which a bunch of industry bodies are represented on. We're talking to certain people about what input they can give us into the standards work, but what we're really hoping to do is pretty soon to get out that consultation paper around the standards ecosystem, and then it'll take us a lot longer to set up a national technical regulator. We'll get standards agreed well before we have a regulator set up. So in the roadmap, the plan is to have voluntary adoption of an agreed set of standards. So I think through the consultation process, that'll be really important, and that should be like in the next month or two. It'll be really important to have people engage with that with a view to looking at the voluntary uptake of the standards before there's any kind of mandating in the future.
Excellent, and I certainly encourage you all to have a look at the DQ website as well. There's contacts and everything to try and get through there and pose questions. So, great way to be in touch. Dominic, we've had a question in relation to largely that private sector challenge and the incentives, aligning that incentives to engage with a complex system. How do you see that that playing out to have the large number of sources incorporated into a system that has communal benefit, but individual private choices being made within there?
Yeah, and I think there's a few questions in there which I think speak to the same. And often we hear, hey, networks, you guys are really slow and cumbersome and driving us insane. And then on the other side of the mouth, we hear, hey, networks, can you just not overreach here and stay in your box, stay in your lane? So I think there's a challenge of actually acknowledging that a lot of what we're talking about is getting more complex, and that complexity is going to be solved through dialogue, through collaboration, through partnerships in a way that we haven't seen necessarily in the past. In the past, it's been easy to delineate between regulated, unregulated, competitive, and uncompetitive, and we've stuck with nice, clear lines of delineation. If we're going to really maximize value, we're going to have to start having those conversations more and collaborating more. And to James's point, remembering that the customer is at the heart of this, and how the customer is properly incentivized, brought along on this journey is absolutely key. They're not interested in one side of the energy system saying one thing and another saying something else, and not being able to access all of those value pools together. So I think if we're looking at it through the customer lens, we could start answering these questions in a far better way. While I've got this, if I can go back, not to derail you, there was a really great question early on about the demand forecast, right? And I think this is actually, to be honest, if I put myself in the shoes of the regulator and policymakers, it's probably the hardest thing, right? Because you have to make a call on what demand actually is going to look like, and what we're seeing across the world, right? The US is seeing demand really increasing. Manufacturing, the IRA, that might change under Trump again, but AI and data centers increasing demand in a way that they haven't seen for 30 years. Europe's seeing the opposite. They're seeing industry starting to leave. They're seeing cost competitive starting to come through. So we're asking everyone to make a call, especially with data centers and AI, like starting to really potentially throw that right out of whack as to what that demand looks like. And then everything we build underneath needing to hit the Goldilocks of not too soon, not too late, perfectly in place for demand. And I think this is something we really do need to lean into, is that the precision is hard, but even getting the direction is hard, because it's linked to economic factors, political factors, everything in such a broad way, which is why we love energy, which is why so many of us are on this call, because it's not just about energy, is it? It's about so much more than that.
Well, it's not just demand there, but where is that demand as well? Because that becomes a lot more. We've now got many more tools to address the localization to match both the local generation and distribution. And it's really the driving force behind why we think, from a CFONet perspective with energy enhanced system planning, is that distribution thinking, the demand impacts of electrification need to come through far more in the integrated plan, and the considerations being there for that. But it's not just that's only a bit of it, as you say. Really, the large scale stuff from demand from data centers, etc., really can be a challenge, but also the flexibility in that demand, or what underlies that flexibility, could be one of the biggest opportunities that we've got in there as well. Matt, we've spoken a bit about the regulatory framework and fostering competition into it, and how do we do this in both a market efficient and meeting our goals type approach?
Yeah.
Should the focus be on speed or competition?
I think, of course, in everything you need to have balance over the long run. But in the immediate term, the authorities heard and is inclined to think that speed is the priority right now, and so we've seen, the mass deployment of PV in distribution systems, but storage hasn't kept up, and so we need to catch up. And so that's why I say we need to go for speed right now. Of course, in the long run, we need to come back to competition and getting cost-effective outcomes, the best cost-effective outcomes for consumers, absolutely. But in the near term, the authorities have the view that there's some near-term goals, significant goals that can be achieved with storage in distribution systems. That might mean that we have to just rebalance our views on competition versus speed just for the next 5 years or so, in order to get that storage deployed that we desperately need.
Okay. Pierluigi, are you seeing barriers there at the moment from long-term planners to consider big batteries, C&I storage, to displace gas peakers? And is that a barrier, or is there something that we can do to accelerate that?
Well, if we look at this from a planning perspective, I think it's just a matter to try to capture properly everything in the planning methodologies, and of course all costs, including natural costs and so on, in an appropriate way, both the transmission and distribution. Then, of course, from a market perspective, in practice, the question becomes: would distributed energy resources have access to the opportunity to play in the market and then displace in an appropriate way the gas turbines? So I think there are two slightly different questions. I think from planning perspective, there is no reason, but from a market perspective, we need to check that there are no barriers that would be like obvious or in some cases hidden.
So we're coming to that point where we're coming towards the end of the webinar here. I'll come to the panelists and actually ask them to reflect on something they've heard from another speaker, or a thought that's been sparked from the questions that have come up from the audience in just a moment. But just before we do, maybe just get your thoughts on a key priority to focus on across NEM-related storage, and why is that the priority? What is one key priority to focus on? Given that you've got your list already there, James, I might come to you first, and then we'll go to Dom.
One single priority?
It's very hard when you've just given 14 distinct actions that need to be taken.
Okay. I would say, because I focus on the small scale end, I would say in that world, interoperability, but I would couple that with data sharing and visibility. At a slightly more macro level, looking at the NEM, you did ask also to reflect on a comment made by another speaker, so I might double up and do that now too. Dominique commented that they all have their purpose. And so I think it's going to be important to keep an eye on the changing cost structures for all the different kinds of storage, because what we think might be the solution now in terms of what is the right storage to roll out may change very quickly, and it will be the technology costs are changing very fast. And what we need in terms of behind the meter storage versus distribution level storage versus utility level batteries or pumped hydro, that mix can shift around very quickly. So I think it's important to keep an eye on those things and be policy responsive. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, James. Dom.
So to your first point on
key priority,
the one thing, yeah. I mean, our model was pretty clear on this. So we could put another 5 gigawatts of storage in between now and 2030 at that substation level. It's entirely doable. It's entirely practical. We're seeing great progress with the community battery program. We're seeing progress with the number of DNSPs putting in and working with retailers to get this going. So what you'd need is really the AER to not do this battery by battery, because you're not going to get 5 megawatts in 5 gigawatts, sorry, battery by battery. You would 5 megawatts, and you would really need to make sure that you're getting that value pool accurately prescribed. So that would be my wish list.
Excellent. Matt, a key priority for you?
To know where the opportunities are and the constraints are in the distribution system. Where are the big opportunities and the big benefits for deploying substation level batteries, for example, just to pick up Dom's point there? In which distribution system and where would that be best? And also, where are the big opportunities and where are the current where's the current free capacity to try and really push more CNI rooftop solar in and the storage with that? Where are those opportunities as well? So I guess I'm thinking about it in a spatial way, a map of where the opportunities are, where the gaps and opportunities are.
Excellent. Pierluigi, from your perspective, can you think of a key priority?
I think key priority also for me is really try to align all forms of storage that we can develop with rooftop PV. Especially that is the cheapest generation system we have in the world. We should just use it, but to really use it properly from a system perspective, we need to couple it with very cheap storage. And this other is there, as I said, hot water, or would be there. Electric vehicles, maybe an electric vehicle may be cheaper than a battery, like stationary battery, but it's also a car sometimes. So these are the kind of things that we're seeing with electric vehicles. So really try to understand what we can do better when and identify how to couple it to rooftop PV. That's really essential.
And then, Pierluigi, just reflecting back on something that you've heard from someone else or the questions today, is there something that sparked a thought for you or been of particular interest?
No, I think in particular, all this discussion happened between, for example, substation level storage and behind the meter storage or community battery substation level storage. I think that's really important debate we need to understand. I think from a techno-economic perspective, certainly community battery and substation level batteries at the level of the network makes lots of sense. But then when you start looking at the other forms of storage you may have, how do you coordinate it properly? Because we always think batteries versus batteries. But then again, you start putting hot water, start putting electric vehicles, the requirements change, the impact on the network changes. Maybe we will not have curtailment, voltage issues the moment you have lots of distributed storage anyway. So I think all of this needs to be studied a little bit better, but certainly very, very interesting.
Thank you, Pierluigi. Matt, a reflection on something that you've heard today.
Yeah, just quickly, Pierluigi and James have focused on a little bit on hot water storage. So yeah, big opportunity there, and it just makes so much sense. That got stuck in my mind. Dom's point just a moment ago: 5 gigawatts of storage at the substation level over the next 5 years sounds like a good idea. And James's point about social license in the distribution system being different to on the transmission, that it's social license comes through the electricity bills and the costs of these things rather than necessarily their physical manifestation. That was an interesting observation.
I agree. Dominique?
Look, I thought it was pretty bold of Matt to come right out and say it when it came to speed versus competition, and actually speed is top there. And so I commend you on that, Matt, because like we spoke on demand, you can get perfect precision, but if you get your demand assumptions and you're short, you're going to have a far greater cost. I would say on that one, I think there's a coordination value there as well. So speed, competition, and coordination, and really having that as the focus doesn't necessarily mean costs are going up. In fact, it can be the opposite.
Well, I've certainly enjoyed it. I think I've heard strongly coming through pull all levers as well. I know I enjoy the mental exercise of trying to think of what that grid can look like in the future. It's one that I certainly get very excited about. And as we come to the end of our ESP project, we'll be releasing more and more findings over the next couple of months, in particular around that May period when you'll see how it will all come together. And there's some really pretty interesting things starting to come through. Can I please thank all of our presenters? Can I please thank all of our participants as well? Your questions were excellent, and I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of them. There's never enough time, and yet we tried to group them up. So thank you very much. We will let you know of an upcoming webinar soon. Please keep in touch via LinkedIn or through our website. Thank you very much.